At 35,000 feet, 16-year-old Amara Johnson stood frozen in the narrow airplane aisle, clutching a small, insulated pouch to her chest. In her other hand, her phone trembled, mid-call to someone who could change everything. The flight attendant's cold blue eyes locked on Amara's, her lips curling in quiet disdain. Without a word, she snatched the vial from the pouch and, in one smooth motion, dropped it into the plane's trash bin. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Amara's breath caught. That vial wasn't just medicine. It was her lifeline. And in that instant, everyone on board became part of a battle they didn't see coming. The hum of the engines was steady, almost soothing, until it wasn't. I saw her, Amara, halfway down the aisle, a slim figure in a plain hoodie and faded jeans, standing utterly still. One hand clutched the small insulated pouch against her chest. The other held her phone mid-call, knuckles white from the grip. Her brown eyes darted between the screen and the woman blocking her path. Elise Porter stood tall, her navy uniform crisp, her posture immaculate, her expression carved from ice. A faint crease formed between her brows as she extended one manicured hand. "Give me that," she said, her voice flat, more command than request. Amara hesitated, her lips parting to speak, but Elise didn't wait. With a quick, practiced motion, she reached into the pouch and plucked out a single vial, its contents pale and glistening under the cabin's lights. I was on my feet before I even realized it, but the aisle between us felt impossibly long. Without breaking eye contact with my daughter, Elise dropped the vial into the small silver trash compartment mounted against the galley wall. The lid snapped shut with a muted click. The action was deliberate, final, like sealing a door that would never be opened again. A sharp gasp escaped Amara. Her shoulders jerked as if she'd been struck. Around her, conversations died mid-sentence, replaced by a heavy, suffocating quiet. "That's my medicine," she whispered, her voice trembling. But Elise had already turned away, her polished shoes clicking softly against the carpeted floor. I watched my daughter's gaze fall to the spot where the vial had been only moments ago, her breathing uneven. She looked small, too small for 16, caught between disbelief and the dawning horror of what had just happened. Her phone hung limply at her side now, the call still open, the faint sound of someone's voice leaking through. "Amara," I called, my voice lower than I intended, heavy with urgency. She didn't move. For a moment, I wasn't sure if she'd even heard me. The passengers nearby kept their eyes down, their bodies angled away in that subtle, self-protective way people do when trouble appears. Not one hand reached out. Not one word was spoken. I stepped into the aisle, my pulse thudding in my ears. My instinct screamed at me to confront Elise immediately, to demand she retrieve the vial. But another voice, colder, sharper, warned me not to give her the reaction she might be hoping for. Instead, I closed the distance to Amara, placed a hand on her shoulder, and guided her back toward our seats. Her body felt tense, rigid, as though bracing for another blow. The cabin's air felt heavier now, thick with the unspoken knowledge that something deeply wrong had just occurred. I could feel every pair of eyes flicker toward us, then quickly away. No one said it out loud, but the message was clear. This wasn't their problem. For me, it had just become the only problem. I eased Amara back into her seat, keeping my hand on her shoulder as if my touch alone could shield her from the damage already done. She sat rigid, eyes fixed on nothing, her breathing shallow. I wanted to hold her until the trembling stopped, but time was already against us. My name is Dr. Malcolm Johnson. For 2 decades, I've walked the sterile corridors of pediatric wards, fighting diseases most people can't even pronounce. I co-founded the Hale Johnson Institute, a biomedical research facility that's made quiet but critical strides in immune therapy. Outside a select circle, no one knows that. I've kept it that way, preferring to work without the weight of public attention. Amara is my only child. 6 years ago, juvenile dermatomyositis stole her strength, her mobility, even her ability to feed herself. For months, I watched her body turn against her, every flare a thief taking a little more of her life. And then, a breakthrough. A biologic therapy, custom engineered for her genetic markers. Not a pill you could pick up at the corner pharmacy. It had to be kept at a precise cold temperature, each vial manufactured through a process so specialized that replacing even one could take over a week. That's what had been in the insulated pouch Elise Porter had just discarded like kitchen waste. I reached down and adjusted the blanket across Amara's lap. "We're okay," I murmured, though my voice carried a note even I didn't believe. "We'll figure this out." Her eyes flickered to mine, dark and glassy, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. I could feel the fear in her grip on my sleeve. Every instinct urged me to storm down that aisle, to demand restitution on the spot, to make Elise understand what she'd just done. But I've been in enough battles, medical and otherwise, to know that anger without strategy is just noise, and noise is easy to ignore. Instead, I forced myself to lean back, to slow my breathing, to think. The vial was gone, at least physically. But the true leverage wasn't in the liquid Elise had destroyed. It was in the consequences that act would set in motion. I glanced around the cabin. Some passengers were still sneaking glances at us. Others had already returned to their books, their screens, their in-flight drinks. No one seemed willing to get involved. That was fine. I didn't need their help. What I needed was timing. Amara shifted beside me, drawing her knees closer, as if making herself smaller. I rested my hand over her, a silent promise. She would not fight this alone. Not here, not now, but soon. The galley smelled faintly of reheated meals and burnt coffee. Elise stood with her back to me, speaking in clipped tones to a woman whose silver hair was pulled into a tight bun. The name tag read Dana Wu, Purser. "Small unmarked pouch," Elise was saying, her voice carrying a note of self-importance. The girl became defensive, and her father refused to cooperate. Defensive? My hands curled into fists. Dana's brow furrowed as she glanced past Elise toward me. I stepped forward into the narrow space, keeping my voice level. "If by defensive you mean my daughter was holding her prescribed, TSA-cleared, life-sustaining medication, yes, she was." Before Dana could reply, a male voice joined in from behind. Arthur Bell, the captain, stood in the galley entrance, arms folded, a faint scowl under his neatly trimmed mustache. "What seems to be the issue here?" Elise straightened as though a higher authority had arrived to confirm her narrative. "Suspicious package, Captain." Passenger wouldn't comply. I followed procedure. Bell's gaze shifted to me. "Sir, I'm sure this is a misunderstanding. If the medication is that important, we can arrange for it to be replaced when we land. There's no need to escalate." I almost laughed at the simplicity of it. Replace it? As if you could walk into a Walgreens and ask for a custom compounded biologic engineered for one patient. The ignorance was breathtaking, but I held my tongue. Movement caught my eye. Just past the curtain dividing the galley from the cabin, a young woman in a denim jacket was leaning back in her seat, phone angled upward. Her expression was calm, focused. She wasn't scrolling. She was broadcasting. Lexi Quill. I didn't know her name yet, but I recognized the look of someone gathering ammunition. Elise's voice intruded. "Captain, I'm responsible for the safety of this flight." The nature of the item was unclear, and the passenger was uncooperative. "Uncooperative?" I cut in, my tone sharper now. "I offered documentation. You ignored it. That's not a safety protocol. That's willful negligence." Dana stepped between us, palms raised. "Let's not make a scene." Too late for that. The scene was already being made, captured no doubt in full HD from 14B. In that moment, the path forward crystallized. I couldn't win this by arguing with a flight attendant or convincing a captain who'd already decided which side he was on. I needed to shift the weight, put every ounce of legal and operational risk squarely onto the captain's shoulders. Make him understand that his problem wasn't me. It was the liability he was about to inherit. I smiled faintly. not from amusement, but from certainty. This wasn't just about a vial anymore. It was about control, and I was about to take it back. The air in the galley was taut, as if the plane itself had paused to listen. I stepped forward, my voice steady, but carrying enough weight to silence the murmur of passengers nearby. "Captain Bell," I said, locking eyes with him, "I am formally declaring that passenger Amara Johnson," I inclined my head toward my daughter, "is medically unfit to continue this flight due to the actions of your crew. This is now a medical emergency, created entirely on board this aircraft." Bell's jaw shifted. "Sir," I didn't let him finish. "Under FA Regulations, Part 121, Subpart 5, Section 121.557, once the pilot in command is notified of a medical emergency, you are obligated to evaluate the necessity of immediate diversion. Continuing without proper medical mitigation opens you, and this airline, to severe regulatory and civil liability." Dana's eyes flickered, the trained composure of a senior crew member cracking just enough for me to see the unease beneath. Elise folded her arms, but her shoulders had stiffened. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be," Bell said, his tone edging toward irritation. I leaned in just enough to ensure he heard every word. "Complication is ignoring the problem until it walks into a courtroom, or worse, into an FAA investigation. And I will make certain both happen if this continues." A cough from behind drew my attention. A man in his late 50s, gray at the temples, wearing a navy sport coat, stepped closer. "Pardon the interruption," he said, his voice calm but deliberate. "Name's Daniel Burke. I spent 20 years as corporate counsel for North Atlantic Airways. I heard the exchange from my seat, and I'm prepared to give a statement to the proper authorities." Elise's gaze darted to Bell, then to Dana. Bell's frown deepened, though I couldn't tell if it was aimed at me or the shifting ground under his feet. "Captain," Daniel continued, "Dr. Johnson is correct about the regulation. If you've been formally notified of a medical emergency, it's on you now. Ignoring that notice is, how shall I put it, career suicide." The word hung there, heavier than the pressurized air around us. Bell's mouth opened, then closed again. He glanced toward the cockpit, then back to me. I could see the calculation in his eyes, the mental weighing of pride against consequence. I didn't press further. The point had been made. My position was no longer a passenger's plea. It was a legal declaration, witnessed and supported by someone who knew exactly what it meant. The power had shifted, even if only slightly. And once it shifts, you don't give it back. I returned to my seat without another word to the captain or his crew. The aisle felt narrower now, but I welcomed the distance between us. This wasn't the place to argue anymore. It was the place to set the clock ticking. Amara was staring out the window, her reflection faint in the plexiglass. I sat down beside her, took a slow breath, and pulled my phone from my jacket pocket. There was no rush in my movements, just a deliberate calm that masked the calculation running in my head. First, I opened my email client. In the subject line, I typed, "Passenger medical emergency, Flight 628, immediate record." The recipients were twofold: the Skybridge Air Operations Center and their corporate liability insurance provider, whose contact I'd kept from a prior consulting engagement. The body of the message was short and clinical. A timestamp, my credentials as Amara's treating physician, the nature of her condition, the fact that her medication had been destroyed by a crew member, and my formal declaration that she was now medically unfit to continue the flight without intervention. I included the phrase, "Notification under FAA Part 121.557. That alone was enough to raise eyebrows in any compliance department. Next, I placed a brief call, not to the captain, but directly to the airline's operations manager on duty. My tone was calm, professional, and utterly devoid of anger. I simply recited the facts I'd just emailed, requested that the incident be logged, and reminded them that their insurer had been copied on the correspondence. No threats, no shouting, just a paper trail, one they couldn't erase. When I ended the call, I slid the phone back into my pocket and looked at Amara. "We're still okay," I told her quietly. She gave a faint nod, but her hands were still clasped tightly in her lap. Somewhere up front, I imagined the cockpit phone ringing, a voice from the ground explaining to Captain Bell that the incident was no longer contained to his cabin, that the insurance team was already aware, that any further decisions he made would be made under a spotlight. It wasn't about making them afraid of me. It was about making them afraid of their own system, the protocols, the auditors, the regulators. I just pulled them all into the cabin without moving from my seat, and now, all I had to do was wait for the weight of that system to start pressing back. I didn't need to see the cockpit to know when the call from dispatch came through. The faint chime over the PA, the pause in engine hum as the intercom clicked. Small signs that the conversation up front had shifted from routine to urgent. Captain Bell emerged minutes later, his expression tighter than before. He didn't look at me as he passed down the aisle toward the galley, but the quick stride and clipped nod to Dana told me enough. He'd been briefed. From my seat, I watched the subtle ripples spread through the crew. Dana pulled Elise aside, whispering low and fast. Elise's face changed, still defensive, but now tinged with something else: wariness. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I glanced at the screen. A message from a colleague in Washington who monitored aviation chatter. "Malcolm, your flight's tail number just popped up in a trending thread. Somebody's posting live from on board." I didn't have to guess who. The young woman in the denim jacket, Lexi, was still in her seat, her phone angled just enough to keep the camera steady. I couldn't hear her voice, but the glowing comments feed was moving so fast it blurred. Somewhere in Skybridge's corporate office, their PR team had just realized a live, unfiltered broadcast was carrying this incident into the court of public opinion. And from the way Lexi's viewers were climbing by the second, that court was filling fast. I knew how airline operations worked. If they pushed on to their destination, the crew was already cutting it close to their FAA-mandated duty hours. Any delay on the ground, deplaning, dealing with paramedics, would risk timing out the crew entirely. That meant grounding the plane until replacements could be flown in. Costly, disruptive, and exactly the kind of chain reaction operations managers dread. Then there was the slot schedule. Major airports guard their landing slots like gold. Miss one, and you don't just wait. You lose your place in a tightly woven web of arrivals and departures. A single missed slot can set off a domino effect that ripples across the network for hours. I leaned back, letting the hum of the engines fill the space between thoughts. The beauty of leverage is that once it starts working, you don't have to force it. You just let gravity pull the weight in your direction. Up front, another chime sounded, followed by a pause. Bell's voice came over the PA, calm but edged with strain. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience as we work through a situation on board. We'll update you shortly." Translation: the system was feeling the strain, and strain has only one direction to go, until something gives. The announcement came without fanfare, but it hit the cabin like a dropped wrench in a silent room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Bell's voice said over the PA, steady but devoid of warmth. "Due to a medical situation on board, we will be diverting to Denver International Airport. We appreciate your cooperation during this unscheduled change." For a heartbeat, there was only quiet. Then the murmurs began. First a trickle, then a swell. "You've got to be kidding me," a man in business class muttered loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "I've got a meeting in San Francisco in 3 hours." "This is ridiculous," another voice snapped from behind me. "Why can't they just get her help when we land?" The words weren't directed at me by name, but their meaning was clear enough. Amara flinched beside me. I kept my eyes forward, letting the comments roll past like distant traffic. I'd learned long ago that the loudest complaints often came from those with the least at stake. Through the corner of my eye, I caught movement from 14B. Lexi adjusted her phone, the camera still trained on the cabin. Her voice was calm, almost conversational, but it carried. "For those just joining, the captain has announced we're diverting to Denver due to a medical emergency involving a passenger's life-saving medication. This stream is now at..." 103,000 viewers. The number landed harder than any insult from the row behind me. Elise, standing stiff near the galley, glanced sharply toward Lexi, then to Dana. Dana's expression didn't change, but the set of her jaw told me she understood exactly what that number meant. 100,000 people weren't just watching, they were judging. Every second of inaction, every dismissive glance, every clipped word from the crew was being etched into the public record in real time. I met Elise's gaze across the aisle. For the first time, the icy certainty in her eyes had melted into something else. Recognition. Not of me personally, not yet, but of the fact that this situation had escaped her control. A passenger in the row ahead leaned over his seat back toward me. "Is your daughter going to be okay?" he asked quietly. I nodded once. "She will be," I said. I made sure my voice was just loud enough to carry 2 rows forward and back. "She's going to be okay because we're not letting this get buried." The hum of the engine seemed louder now, a reminder that we were still in motion, but not toward the destination anyone had planned. And in that shift of direction, both literal and figurative, the balance of power had moved again. This was no longer just a father protecting his child. It was a spotlight, and everyone in its glare was starting to feel the heat. The wheels hit the Denver runway with a heavy thud, the deceleration pressing us forward in our seats. Outside, the lights of the terminal blurred past, but inside the cabin, tension clung like static. We rolled to a stop at a remote gate. The seatbelt sign chimed off, but before anyone could stand, the PA crackled again. "For the family in row 14, please remain seated. Medical personnel and airport officials will be boarding momentarily." A low rumble of annoyance moved through the rows. "Unbelievable," someone muttered. "We're already late." Another voice hissed, "Should have just taken your pills at home." Amara stared at her lap, hands twisting the hem of her hoodie. Before I could speak, Lexi's voice cut through. "To everyone watching the stream," she said calmly, her phone still steady. "We've just landed in Denver. I'll continue filming until I see this passenger, this young woman, treated with the dignity she deserves." The jet bridge connected with a metallic clunk. Moments later, the forward door opened, and a wave of new faces stepped inside. 2 uniformed airport security officers, a paramedic team in red jackets, and a man in a Navy suit with a visitor badge clipped to his lapel. "Dr. Johnson?" the man asked, scanning the cabin until his eyes found me. "I'm Rafael Ortiz, Terminal Operations Manager." His voice was polite, but there was a sharp undercurrent. A man juggling urgency and damage control. I stood, meeting him halfway down the aisle. "Before we do anything else," I said, "my daughter needs immediate transfer to University of Colorado Hospital. She requires specialist evaluation within hours. You will arrange private medical transport." Ortiz nodded slowly. "We can..." "And," I continued, "Skybridge will book accommodations for us at a hotel adjacent to the hospital. They will cover all medical costs resulting from the destruction of her medication. This is non-negotiable." Behind him, Dana appeared with Elise hovering at her shoulder. Elise's arms were crossed, her expression defensive but brittle. She opened her mouth, but Ortiz raised a hand without looking at her. "Not now." One of the paramedics, a woman with kind eyes named Linda, crouched beside Amara's seat. "Hi there, sweetheart," she said gently. "We're going to take you somewhere safe, okay?" Amara gave a faint nod, though her eyes stayed on me. I placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're going to be fine," I said. And this time I meant it. Not because the crisis was over, but because I could feel the balance tipping further in our favor. Ortiz's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, and for a fraction of a second, his carefully managed expression slipped. Something had just escalated, and not in Skybridge's favor. By the time Amara was wheeled down the jet bridge toward the waiting ambulance, the story had already escaped the confines of the cabin. A local news crew, tipped off by Lexi's live stream, had cameras rolling as we crossed into the terminal. Flashbulbs popped. Questions flew. I kept my answers brief. just enough to confirm that this wasn't over. Within an hour, the first headlines appeared online. Teen's life-saving medication thrown away mid-flight. Plane diverted to Denver. Clips from Lexi's stream were embedded in every article, her steady narration contrasting sharply with the crew's evasive body language. Inside Skybridge Air's headquarters, the fallout began. Their operations team scrambled as the FAA sent an urgent request for incident details. Simultaneously, the airport authority informed them they'd lost 2 priority landing slots at major hubs, slots they'd counted on for lucrative transcontinental routes. Losing those wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a direct hit to their quarterly revenue. Then came the leak. Someone inside dispatch, whether out of conscience or self-preservation, forwarded a copy of the cockpit operations audio log to a journalist. In it, a dispatcher clearly stated, "Captain, passenger's physician has declared medical unfit to fly under Part 121.557. Bell's voice followed. "Understood, but continuing to SFO is preferable and less forced." That single exchange obliterated any claim that Skybridge hadn't been properly informed. The words, "Passenger warned PIC," were highlighted in every analysis that followed. Legal experts interviewed on air explained, in painstaking detail, that this alone could establish negligence if the flight had continued without diversion. By late afternoon, the airline's public relations team issued a terse statement acknowledging an onboard incident currently under review and promising full cooperation with regulatory authorities. But the tone was already defensive, the kind of phrasing that signaled internal panic. Ortiz called me from his office, his voice clipped. "Dr. Johnson, I've been instructed to confirm arrangements for your daughter's care and accommodations. You should also be aware, this has gone beyond our terminal. Corporate and legal are both involved now." I almost felt sorry for him, almost. "Then make sure they understand," I said, "that this is about more than one passenger. It's about a system that enabled this." Outside the hospital window that night, Denver's skyline glittered under the cold air. I knew somewhere in a boardroom, Skybridge executives were staring at projections filled with red lines and warning symbols. And I knew they'd try to frame this as an isolated incident, a training error, a bad apple. But the truth was already out. And once it's out, it doesn't go back in the bottle. The investigation moved quickly, faster than most corporate inquiries ever dared. Within 48 hours, I was seated in a stark conference room at the Denver Airport's administrative wing. Across from me sat 2 FAA investigators, a Skybridge legal representative, and a court reporter tapping steadily at her stenograph machine. Elise Porter was already there when I arrived, her posture stiff, eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the table. The uniform was gone. In its place, a plain blazer that did nothing to soften her edges. The lead investigator began. "Miss Porter, our records show that prior to Flight 628's departure, you conducted a series of online searches. Specifically, you spent approximately 40 minutes reviewing articles about teenagers smuggling fentanyl on commercial flights. Can you confirm?" Elise shifted uncomfortably. Yes, I read some articles. My son had issues with..." "That's not relevant to your duties as a flight attendant," the investigator cut in. "Can you also confirm that you did not follow the Skybridge protocol for verifying medical equipment or medication as outlined in your employee manual? Section 4, subsection B?" Her jaw tightened. "I acted in the best interest of safety." Daniel Burke, seated beside me, leaned forward. "No," he said evenly. "You acted on bias, and I have a sworn statement to that effect." He slid a folder across the table to the investigators. Inside were his handwritten notes from the flight, detailing the exchange in the galley, along with his own professional credentials as former corporate counsel for a major airline. Lexi, patched in via video call, presented her contribution next. Her live stream clips played on a monitor, high definition, time-stamped, with clear audio of the captain's PA announcement and surrounding context. "You'll note," she said, The moment Captain Bell references a medical situation aligns exactly with the timestamp where Dr. Johnson formally declared the passenger unfit to continue under FAA regs. The investigator nodded, jotting notes. Time code alignment is precise, he confirmed. Elise's gaze flicked toward the monitor, her face paling as the reality set in. There was no plausible deniability left. Every word, every action, every omission was preserved in multiple formats, corroborated by independent witnesses. Outside the hearing room, public sentiment was mounting. News outlets replayed the most damning clips on loop. Elise's dismissive body language, my calm but firm declarations, Lexi's unwavering narration. Social media hashtags calling for her termination were trending in 3 countries. The meeting adjourned with the promise of further review, but I could see the trajectory as clearly as if it were written on the wall. Skybridge wasn't just defending a crew member anymore. They were defending the illusion that their system worked. And illusions shatter easily under the weight of truth. 3 weeks later, the press conference was held in a glass-walled auditorium at Skybridge Air's headquarters. The room was packed. Reporters, industry officials, advocacy groups, and more than a few familiar faces from the investigation. Cameras pointed toward a large screen behind the podium, where bold letters announced, "Introducing the Amara Protocol." The CEO, flanked by FAA officials, stepped up first. His voice carried the careful cadence of someone choosing each word with surgical precision. Today, Skybridge Air acknowledges its failure to protect one of our passengers and her medically necessary equipment. We are committed to ensuring such an incident never happens again. He gestured toward the screen as a presentation began, the Amara Protocol, named in honor of my daughter. The guidelines were extensive. Mandatory multi-day training for all public-facing employees on handling temperature-sensitive medical supplies, a step-by-step verification process for any item flagged during boarding, and, most notably, a comprehensive module on implicit bias recognition. Watching the details unfold, I felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't a hollow apology or a PR stunt. These were enforceable changes, complete with timelines, audit requirements, and third-party oversight. Then, the CEO paused. To design and implement this program, we've partnered with one of the leading experts in pediatric immunology and patient advocacy. His gaze shifted toward the front row. Dr. Malcolm Johnson. There it was. My name, my full identity, brought into the open. Until now, I'd kept my role in the story deliberately muted, letting the evidence and the voices of witnesses lead. But stepping onto that stage, I knew it was time to own the position entirely. I approached the podium, the click of cameras marking each step. When my daughter Amara boarded that flight, she wasn't a problem to be managed. She was a patient whose life depended on a small vial of medicine. That vial was destroyed because of ignorance and because of bias. Both are dangerous in isolation. Together, they are catastrophic. I outlined the key aspects of the Amara Protocol, explaining how it wasn't just about one airline. We're sharing this framework with every carrier in the industry, domestic and international. There will be no excuses for failing to handle critical medication with the care it demands. In the crowd, I spotted Lexi, phone in hand, streaming the event live. Daniel sat beside her, arms folded, a faint smile on his face. Elise was nowhere to be seen. When I stepped down, the applause was measured, but it was enough. Change had been set in motion, not just for Amara, but for every passenger who might one day stand in that narrow aisle with their lifeline in their hands. 6 months later, Denver's spring sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Amara's Wings Foundation office. The walls were lined with photographs of children, smiling despite IV lines, grinning from hospital beds, clutching insulated medical pouches just like the one Amara had lost. The foundation had grown faster than I dared to hope. With donations from advocacy groups, private citizens, and even rival airlines, eager to be seen on the right side of history, Amara's Wings was funding cold chain medical transport for children with rare diseases in over a dozen states. We'd already facilitated hundreds of safe deliveries, each one a small victory against the complacency that had nearly cost my daughter her future. Amara sat across the conference table from me, reviewing a scholarship application for a teen with a condition similar to hers. Her hair caught the light as she leaned over the page, her expression focused, determined. She had turned her ordeal into something larger than herself, and I couldn't have been prouder. But the past still had loose ends. I was in Washington for a transport safety summit when I received notice that Skybridge Air's internal disciplinary hearings were concluding. Elise Porter's case was scheduled for that afternoon. Out of a sense of closure, not vengeance, I attended. The hearing room was small, windowless, with a long table dividing the panel from the respondent. Elise was there, her posture slumped, the crisp precision of her former uniform replaced by a plain blouse and worn slacks. The arrogance I'd seen in the galley was gone. She answered the panel's questions quietly, sticking to facts. There was no public shaming, no theatrics, just the formal reading of the findings. Violation of operational protocol, failure to follow medical item verification procedures, and conduct unbecoming of crew. The penalty was termination without severance and a report to the Industry Compliance Registry, effectively ending her commercial flight career. For me, seeing her there wasn't about satisfaction. It was about reality. Actions have consequences, and those consequences had now been recorded in the same system that once shielded her. That evening, back in Denver, I stood at the podium during our foundation's first annual gala. The room was filled with donors, families, and volunteers whose lives intersected through this mission. Cameras flashed, but I spoke not to the lenses, but to the people in front of me. Justice doesn't have to be loud, I said. It doesn't need applause or headlines. It needs to work, quietly, consistently, and without fail. So the next child who boards a plane with their lifeline in hand makes it to their destination without fear. That's all. Amara's smile from the front row told me she understood, and that was enough.